Welcome back, everyone, to Lone Star Spirit. I hope that everyone has been well this past couple of weeks and you have enjoyed the weekend so far. It is Sunday morning, late morning. It's almost 11 o'clock here in Texas, and um, I just hope everybody is doing great. This installment of Lone Star Spirit is going to be a complete, and I know I've said this before, but this is going to be a complete departure from the norm. The subject matter of this episode is very much one of a personal nature, and I do feel compelled to share this story and my thoughts about this story and how it ended up and what my uh, personal beliefs are. I want to share them with you. Now, I'm sure that some of you may be a little uncomfortable with this subject. It's one of those subjects that you probably don't talk about a whole lot at work or with your family or friends and things like that. But maybe it's something we should discuss more openly and honestly, and most importantly, civilly amongst family and friends and things like that. Probably not a great place, great thing to talk about in the workplace, but uh, it's something that needs to be talked about, and definitely let your beliefs be known. Now, for several years, we have pretty much been inundated with the arguments for and against the right. We'll say the right to terminate a pregnancy. Uh, there there are compelling arguments on both sides of the subject, and needless to say, I just like you have my own personal beliefs on the subject, and you will definitely get a better understanding of what those beliefs are by the time I complete this video. And I know that I may get some flack, some comments or anything like that, emails, what have you, that are going to challenge me on this belief, but I, needless to say, I'm ready for it. Before we get started, I do ask that you bear with me as I share the story, as it is something I feel is very important to the end goal, and it kind of sets up where I'm going with this video. There will also be at least one medical term that I will use uh, in this episode. There, with all probably 90% of them, I will have clarifying definitions to the opposite side of the screen. Now, one of these terms is a completely outdated term, and it is one that has been replaced with a more politically correct term. But I will stay true to what is in the report because I actually had to look this one up. It just the way it looked on the paper, just it wasn't computing in the brain. As I've said, I'm a knife, not the sharpest knife. Sometimes I'm a butter knife, but I actually had to look this term up. It just wasn't making any sense to me. It was because it was a term that I had never seen before. But I will give you a warning when that term is coming up. But let's go ahead and get into the story. Uh, Last weekend, I was at my mother's place as we were celebrating her 71st birthday, and my mother is a wonderful woman. She had to put up with this badass kid that, um, whew, man, I wasn't the greatest kid, and I think she did one hell of a job with me. Now, my mother has always been pretty much a stickler when it comes to keeping the house nice and clean and tidy and everything like that. She, I call her every night, and a lot of the times I asked her what she did today, and she said cleaning, because the house was disgusting, and you walk in there and that house is damn near immaculate all the time. So, but during her cleanup, she decided to rearrange her bedroom to create a little bit more space, and she came across some old pictures and decided to go ahead and just separate some pictures and pass them down to us. And these were old pictures of me and my sister and, my son, and just kind of cool things, and we were looking at some of the pictures and having a pretty good time. And I saw an old picture of me, I think it was in 6th grade maybe, and I had a spiked haircut, if you can imagine that, with this bald head. And we're laughing and taking on and whatnot, and I turned the picture around and I said, what in the hell was I thinking with this hairdo? I mean, it was horrible. I might actually just put it up on the screen here and give you an idea of how bad that that hairdo was. But as we were going through these pictures, she pointed out that she had found my little brother's baby book. And she said, there's not a lot to it. And the reason for that is Evan was only with us for just under 7 days. Now, I had seen this book before, maybe about 15 or 20 years ago, but I really didn't pay close attention as to what was in the book. And we decided, hey, let's look at this and turn through the pages of the book. And Mom pointed out that she had both Evan's birth certificate and his death certificate. He was born on April 3rd in Eastland, Texas, and passed away on April 10th of 1980 in Abilene, Texas. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia, and I knew that there were other things going on with Evan, but I didn't quite fully understand. It had been like 15, maybe 20 years ago that I actually read this report, and I didn't understand any of it. But it was the autopsy report. And we often talk about Evan, especially me and my mother, and wonder what he looks like now. Neither one of us really got to see him. Me personally, I was only 6 at the time of Evan's short time on this earth, and the only picture that I had ever seen was a very small Polaroid picture in what I believe was the NICU, and it was from a distance, and you could just see that there were some tubes and looked like bandages, and things were covering his head. You could not see his face. And as I said, it was from a distance. You could tell it was a baby. You couldn't tell anything about the baby other than there's something going on here. I do remember the funeral, at least parts of it, and just not really understanding what was going on. I knew my mother was just completely destroyed. And even though I didn't know what was going on, didn't understand it, I knew that seeing my mother in that condition was very hurtful and challenging even though just I'm 6. You know, we can't process those emotions very well. Now, my mother has been one of the most important people in my life, and she still is to this day. My son Kobe and my mother are the two most important people in my life, and will be until I leave this world. And speaking of my son, excuse me, his middle name is Evan. Um, as I got older, I would often wonder if Evan was ever looking down on me. I felt like he was always there, but maybe in the sense that maybe he was kind of slapping me in the back of the head when I did something stupid. You know, something a brother would do. Just kind of smack you in the back of the head. Hey, you're being stupid. I think about him on a regular basis, and even after 44 years, he's still on my mind. As I started reading the autopsy report, I realized that Evan was never going to be able to have a productive life. It felt like he was dealt a pretty cruel hand, and there was zero chance for him to prosper. And before I get into what I read, I just want to take a few moments to clarify some things. Remember, this is 1980. We did not have the scientific breakthroughs and the obstetric tools that we have today. This was 44 years ago. There were no 3D ultrasounds. There were very limited tests for birth defects and other conditions. And a lot of the tests, like an amniocentesis, can be very dangerous for not only the mother, but the child. And after clarifying with my mother, not once did her OB talk about the possibilities of Evan's conditions. Why? Because these conditions were not seen by the technology of the time. That really does not have too much bearing on what I'm going to convey throughout this video. But as I said earlier, I had glanced at the report once before, didn't understand 90% of what the document said. The only thing that I really truly remembered was the illustration of Evan's face, and that particular image has been burned into my memory ever since the first time I saw it. There were several things that, in all honesty, scared me when I first saw it. And for instance, there was a complete lack of a nose. There was no bridge of the nose. There was no structure there. Just two small holes where one would think the nostrils would be. His eyes were very, very close together, and they appeared to be at a 45-degree angle. And his eyes were not rounded at all. They looked like little slits. There were also polyps on both lateral sides of his face, very close to his ears. And there was also a profile illustration that showed a severely malformed head. And to be blunt, and because I just can't think of another term, it was almost cone shaped. There were some other illustrations, and these were all hand-drawn illustrations that made zero sense to me. I did not understand until I actually read the report this past weekend. And as I said earlier, there's going to be the outdated medical term, and I will give you a warning. But before we get into the report, just please remember this report was written in April of 1980. So please do not become offended by the term. And if you know me, you know that I believe wholeheartedly that being offended is a personal choice. It's not something that just naturally happens. You choose to be offended. You made the choice to be offended. But I'm going to give you the warning. And again, I'm going to have the definitions of the medical terms will be on the opposite side of the screen. So as I read this report, it became just almost overwhelmingly depressing. There was also I guess it's somewhat expected reaction of anger and sadness now that I could actually look up terms and understand what was actually going on with Evan. And the first term that I had to read that I really needed clarification for was hypotelorism. Hypotelorism. This is basically two organs being too close together. And in this instance, the doctor was referring to Evan's eyes. And most likely this was partially due to the absence of the nose. There was no structure there. The bridge of the nose was completely absent. And the appearance of the eyes with the how narrow they were refers to some swelling that was in the lid aspect of the eye area. These terms are going to get increasingly worse as we go, or at least in my opinion, they get progressively worse. Again, bear with me through this because this feeds into the video as a whole. Anencephaly, Arhencephaly, refers to the absence of olfactory bulbs and tracts. And when you talk about olfactory bulbs, tracts, nerves, things of that nature, that has to do 100% with the ability to smell. And basically, Evan would not have the sense of smell. Now, it's not to say that if Evan would have lived and actually started to prosper, that these olfactory tracts and bulbs would not have eventually developed. There's a possibility. Highly unlikely, but it's not out of the realm of possibility. And as some of you may know, the sense of smell also affects the ability to taste. And anosmia, anosmia, is the medical term for a complete lack of smell. And as I continued to read this report, and I'm reading this out loud, mind you, my mind began to ponder the absolute hell that Evan must have felt. Now, we look at fear as something that is experienced by much older human beings. We see it start to really manifest at the 5 to 7 month old era or time frame, and usually as we get older, we have a fear of the dark or fear of the boogeyman being underneath our bed or fear of bright lights, loud noises, strangers, that type of thing. But even at the newborn stage, there is fear there. And I cannot believe that Evan did not feel some kind of fear, problems with breathing and tubes sticking out. It's that there still has to be fear there. But as I continued to go through this report, I could not help but feel a very small sense of relief knowing that Evan was no longer experiencing these horrible things. And I say small because the hell that he was going through, the things that he was fighting that were not his fault, they were no one's fault. That still was kind of overwhelming. The next medical term or finding that I had to look up is sebocephaly or sabocephaly, whichever way you want to pronounce it. But it brought the facial features that Evan displayed to a much better understanding. It's a malformation of the head, and the appearance of the eyes and the nose are also associated with sebocephaly. The report also highlighted that Evan did not have an anterior or posterior, front or back fontanelle. Of course, those are the soft spots in infants, and typically in a healthy newborn, the bones of the skull are not set or sutured. This is to aid with passage through the birth canal. And unfortunately, in Evan's case, these bones were actually sutured. And that's highly abnormal. Here is where the outdated medical term comes into play. The term has been replaced by a more politically correct term, but the old term is pseudo-hermaphroditism. And I'm not even going to try to spell it. I'm going to have it on the side here. As it pertained to Evan, his chromosomal and gonadal sex did not match the external genitalia. Now, the report did not go into detail as to whether the male genitalia was missing or not, whether it was more female in appearance, but the actual term does state that the external sex organs can be ambiguous, meaning it could be neither. Evan was also shown to have hemorrhagic tracheobronchitis, which, with my somewhat limited medical training, I believe most likely led to the pneumonia that eventually took his life. He also had evidence of hyperemia, which is an abnormally high amount of blood in the organs of the body. These last two issues that I want to share are probably the most frightening to me, or it clarifies a lot of stuff, but at the same time, again, this is my brother. He's fighting this. Uh, the report briefly mentions issues with chromosomes 13 and 15. And I actually had to do a little bit of research on this one. And this points to something called Patau syndrome. Now, Patau syndrome is a condition that has a direct effect on the development of the face, brain, and heart. The report did not specifically mention Patau syndrome, but this last condition may point to such a diagnosis. Now, I mentioned earlier about the hand-drawn illustrations, and there was one that just I couldn't understand. And then finally, after reading the findings in the report, the illustration made crystal clear sense. Evan was missing the frontal lobe of his brain. This part of the brain is responsible for movement, memory, judgment, cognitive functions such as self-control, decision-making, and attention span, and of course, social skills. So with the issues with the brain, the malformation of the head, the eyes, the lack of a nose, at the end of the day, Evan would have been blind, deaf, and unable to speak. Something that most of us kind of take for granted. Would not have been able to smell, and more than likely would not have been able to taste anything either. And this would have been an amazing thing for him to come through if he had survived. Now, if you've stayed with me this far, and if you have, I appreciate, but you're probably asking yourself, why in the hell are you sharing this with the whole world? And to be honest, I kind of asked myself that question too. This was a very challenging thing to not only read and look up and learn about, but it was very challenging to write. And of course, this part where I'm sharing. And yes, I did write a bit of a script to keep me on task. And I even went as far as asking my mother if she would object to me talking about this and sharing it pretty much with the world. And fortunately, she did give me her blessing. At the heart of this story is a foundational belief that Evan was brought into this world for a reason. Even if it was only for a short time, his life served a purpose. We as a family, and myself as a brother, as an older brother, were blessed with the presence of Evan. And even if it was only for just under 7 days, it was a blessing. God Almighty does not make mistakes. He is perfect in his wisdom. He knew Evan before time existed, before Evan entered this world, before he was conceived. God knew him, and he sent Evan here on a mission. We may never fully understand what that mission was until we get to see him in heaven. But I will never believe that Evan's short life was worthless. Now, we keep Evan alive in our hearts, and as I said before, we talk about him often. Now, I remember a conversation I had with my mother where she actually doubted her ability to raise a child with Evan's condition. It was at that moment that I realized that God had sent Evan here for not just one purpose, but multiple purposes. It was a reminder that we are given our parents for a reason. And sure, some parents are better than others. But at the end of the day, as children grow, as we grow up to become more self-aware, we have a choice to make changes in our lives, make our lives better. We do not have to follow the footsteps of a lackluster mother or father. If you were brought into this world and you were abandoned, there's a plan for you, and God is watching over you. We can be better than what we came from. But for a son to remind his mother that she was the perfect mother for a badass kid that tried her patience too many times to count. That was the discussion. We would have found a way. God will not give us anything that we cannot handle. And I know my mother would have found a way to make it work. I know that I would have done everything I could to lend a helping hand. Evan is also a reminder that we are given one body, one chance to make our lives meaningful. You are a gift from God. You mean so much to someone in your life, a friend, a sister, a brother, a cousin, an aunt, an uncle, mother, father. So does an infant still in utero. They serve a purpose. They are not sent here willy-nilly. Now, I never got to see or talk to Evan, but he is my brother. And he always will be with me wherever I go. At the end of the day, life is precious. Respect it. Don't end a new life before that new life has a chance to show the absolute power and grace of our Heavenly Father. At the end of this, I have to leave you with this one last statement. And thank you for watching. Thank you for staying with me through this. It was very challenging for me. You disagree with me? Put it in the comments. You agree with me or just want to say something? Put it in the comments below. Share the video. Like the video. All that good stuff. But I will leave you with this one last statement. And you can follow it in the Psalms that I have on the scroll at the bottom of the screen. God's wisdom is infinite, and God's wisdom is infallible. Have a great week, everyone.